Well, thank you for people coming out today. Again, this is the Community Engagement Week. We've been able to collaborate with the Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as the Center for Community Engagement, and really trying to bring awareness to community engagement, thinking about some of the challenges that are in front of us, but also working to think about the new landscape for scholars that are invested in this kind of work. So let's see. I think, as I mentioned earlier in a previous session, that the University of New Mexico is in every county throughout the state of New Mexico. So next slide. One of the things that we're sort of really focused on for the future is really our Carnegie classification for community engagement, and really trying to understand the landscape of the work that's being done currently. But we were able to get this title in 2020, and so it's a title that puts us in a very unique kind of group of people, and institutionally wide, next slide, across the U.S. So we're one of 357 institutions that have this categorization, as well as, we become even more unique in that we're one of the few that have the Hispanic Serving Institution title, as well as an R1 title. So next slide. Again, I just want to thank our members that comprise our advisory committee. I'm joined here with Professor Montoya and Renia Ehrenfort, who's Associate Dean in the School of Architecture here today. And so this group has been really instrumental in bringing together some of the topics that are important to moving the community engagement agenda forward. Next slide. Again, we were able to start a new community engagement website that starts to harness a lot of this activity. Right now, you can find information for Community Engagement Week. Tomorrow, the Center for Teaching and Learning will have their first in-person session, with one to follow on Thursday that's online. Next. But we're here today for a discussion with Professor Montoya to talk about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we see in community engagement. So I'm going to be brief. I have a couple of slides that talk about some of the things that I see in front of us. Next slide. I'm going to start with an article that came out in the Chronicle of Higher Education that really starts to talk about the value of community engagement, and really starts to specify some of the things that is productive in community engagement, but also maybe some of the challenges. And one of the big things that my committee has been kind of focused on, and as well as conversation with the provost, is the tenure and promotion process. And so if you have a chance, this article is really a great resource in terms of starting to think about that discussion. Next slide. And so one of the things that I've been looking at, and the committee has been focusing, are models across the country. And one that I think is really an interesting one is the Indiana University. It's IUPUI, I think it's Purdue University in Indianapolis. And they have a really a different kind of model. So somebody that is a community engaged scholar can apply for tenure and promotion through a different venue, and that actually a subcommittee that sits under the Provost Review Committee actually validates the work of community engagement. And so it's something that we're looking at implementing and maybe having discussion about for the future. So next slide. And then, I think institutionally wise, I think that we've always acknowledged the work that that we have here at University of New Mexico in terms of community engagement. We've, for years, have been able to offer the Community Engagement Research Lecturer Award. And there's a really unique rubric in the way that gets understood and measured. And so, next slide. Some of the scholars that have been recognized across UNM are here. So since 2016, we've been able to acknowledge some of the great work that faculty have done over the years. And so that being said, I think that there's a clear understanding at our institution that we value this, but in terms of tenure and promotion, that is not something that is really has been focused on. I think in terms of departments and potentially a couple of schools, that has been embedded in their policies, but it isn't something that's kind of ubiquitous and across the university, across the university. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Montoya, and next slide, and have him talk about some of the things he's been thinking about in terms of tenure and promotion and really his experience in this kind of landscape. So.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And thanks everybody for your time. I know it's a busy time of year, and especially for people who are doing community engaged research, they're already doing the work, and so this becomes a very, very arduous process sometimes, especially in the spring to attend discussions. But I hope that we can have a back and forth on this, and it's not just me simply listing off the bullet point. When Tim approached me in talking about community engaged research, my mind immediately went to the historicization of the academic products that we have already in place. And I did a little bit of digging, and part of this was already, I think, from a previous part of my career, where I was charged with trying to develop an evaluation system for community engaged research or non-peer-reviewed journal articles at the Anderson School. And so while I was there, I got to thinking about why people call the peer-reviewed journal the gold standard. And so I created a little timeline here. It's not comprehensive by any stretch, but it's something that helps at least prompt a discussion about why we valorize certain aspects of research production over others. And the one that keeps, I think if I go right to the middle and then go backwards and forwards, we get to the peer-reviewed journal, which everybody would not dispute is a part of our academic production. It's the signature of how we do research at an R1 institution, not just here, but in other institutions. But I had to ask myself, like, peer-reviewed journals weren't always around. In fact, I was looking at some of the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals, and they're not even 100 years old. And if you think about the age of the academy, that's interesting. And it got me thinking, well, what is the logic of the peer-reviewed journal? I'm going to propose a few things, and I'd like for you to back and forth with me on this, just to see where your brain goes with this. But the peer-reviewed journal, in my very superficial inspection of what the peer-reviewed journal is, really galvanizes itself between the periods of World War I and World War II. And a lot of that had to do with the fields of disease control and also weapons development. And so here in New Mexico, clearly, the peer-reviewed journal was also about having an instrument in place to be able to check and fact-check certain aspects of the development of weapons, including an atomic weapon, that would then serve an immediate or urgent purpose or an urgent need. And the peer-reviewed journal becomes a very good way for people to check each other's work or to have a conversation in a very condensed period of time, even if it's only 1 or 2 years that you're waiting for the process to publish something in a peer-reviewed journal. That becomes it almost becomes a habit that we have. We can expect that we're submitting an article for review, and that means that we can do other things, and we've developed a calendar inside of our routines here in the Academy that organizes around the peer-reviewed journal and the time it takes to do so. But the reality is that we've had other types of academic products since time immemorial that have been more dependent on longer periods of time and longer ways of developing an intellectual, what we would call an intellectual product today, including archival scripts. The book didn't go away. I know that's a shocker to a lot of people, but people still publish books, and those books take a much longer period of time, A, to develop, and B, to then produce as an instrument of peer review and also academic production. The monograph, and I don't just mean books, I mean essays, reflections. Those were things that public intellectuals and academics would do for a very long period of time, and they would actually be the dominant way in which academics were rewarded or measured for their activity in the academy well before the development of the peer-reviewed journal in the middle of the 20th century. So it got me thinking, there's other things. This is about forms. Community engaged research is not just a discussion about whether or not it's it's permissible or whether or not it exists in the world. It's true, they exist in the world. We engage with community and we do this type of work. The problem is that we often, I think, revert to a very cliche and standardized way of thinking about the academic forms. I even remember going on to Sedona about 3 years ago, which is one of those databases that I don't know if everybody uses or has seen Sedona, but it's just a human resource database where you put in your research. And I remember that was actually one of the common resources or databases that I used. And I remember punching in my work, and I remember having just finished curating a museum show. It took me 2 years to produce that. We used the Smithsonian recommended guidelines for curating the show. The way that we published and the way that we produced the essay in conjunction with the museum and the community that was sponsoring the show, it took the better part of 2 years to produce, and it was, by any stretch of the imagination, a significant time commitment for everybody involved. And inside of that, when I put it into the system, and it asked for type of academic production, it said peer-reviewed journal, and then it said non-PRJ, and then it said non-intellectual contribution. And I remember that being like, wow, okay, so I'll go with the other one. I'll go with non-PRJ, because I know it's not a peer-reviewed journal, so I'll put it in non-PRJ, see where it flies. I got a report back that indicated that the information I had put in was not sufficient for a quote non-PRJ journal, and that it would have to be registered as a non-intellectual contribution. If that's the way that we kind of default to how we think about non-PRJ forms, we're in a lot of trouble, because the morale issue, even just reading that and then seeing it published in my like updated CV as with a subheading non-intellectual contributions, with a whole lot of non-intellectual contributions at play, made me think about challenge my notions of intellect and whether or not I actually had a working brain. And so I think it's important to kind of think about that, because I think peer review exists in all of these forms that we're talking about. It could be in performances, it can be in orations, letters, testimonies. There's lots of ways that kind of manifest within both Western and non-Western traditions of how we have intellectual products. But I think the concept of peer review gets imported into the journal, the PRJ, so much that it becomes a monolith within our academic thinking. And anything that is outside of that gets another conversation, which is we need to return to rigor, because rigor becomes kind of a placeholder for work that isn't, like the non-intellectual contribution. It becomes a default way of thinking, because it's just not rewarded or incentivized in the way that we've already crystallized the academy and the R1 designation. Next slide, please. And so I think one of the ways that we can think through community engagement is to then introduce a variety of forms to those conventions, because we can preach to one another all we want, and I think we all get it, and we're all open to the possibility of academic work operating in different times and taking different times, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an annual review. It doesn't translate into the technical aspects of the faculty handbook, and it definitely doesn't manifest as a universal directive within each of these, within each department that is chosen or tasked to interpret the faculty handbook of research, teaching, and then some service. So one of the things that I kind of put up on the board are, if there are some ways of introducing and changing the culture around a gold standard peer review centric type of model that sees everything else as non-intellectual or non-rigorous, here are a few of them. One, you create a formal petition or process for identifying quality, because that becomes the first thing that people ask. Well, you curated a show, but how do I know that that's A, quality, and B, how is it memorialized? It's a lot of reporting to try to get somebody up to speed about the work that you did for 2 years that they have really kind of no insight or window into. So you can do that kind of formal petition. The other one is obviously a change to university policy, and that either happens either by directive or through the faculty handbook. or another one is to establish quality frameworks, which is not necessarily specific prescriptions, but at least different baskets for which we understand how knowledge is memorialized, archived, and disseminated, including different ways of thinking about academic forms, like a performance or a curation. And the last one is to change attitudes. You give faculty reasons to see each other's work in a different light and to valorize forms that are unconventional to within certain circles. Those are 4 that I came up with, but I think that there's many others in which we can do this type of work. Next slide. So I mean, the combination is arduous. I mean, if we go with the first option, what you're doing is you're placing an additional burden on somebody who's already done a tremendous amount of work to develop community-engaged research. As they understood it, they're able to prove that it's rigorous and it has a quality process or an excellence mechanism inside of it. But now you're asking somebody to do another bureaucratic process to demonstrate what would already be taken for granted in a peer-reviewed journal. And so how do you navigate that challenge? And that's why I said I listed the other 3 as kind of a way of calibrating those sorts of things. I recall at one instance when I put the museum show together and I wanted it to count as an intellectual product, I remember that the proposal kind of led to an 8-page form that then kind of led to how does this compare to a peer-reviewed journal, or more, I think more in default-oriented thinking, how do you then, is this going to lead toward a peer-reviewed journal in the future? And so this becomes still kind of the classic foundational point of reference. The peer-reviewed journal kind of becomes the thing that you have to then kind of justify yourself in relation to, or you have to bureaucratize yourself in relation to it in order to legitimize any of the other forms that are possible. And so my question, I think, just as a general point of discussion is, if we're going to have a technical apparatus that helps us evaluate excellence and quality and community engagement, of these 4 processes, what is the sequence? What is the most reasonable investment of our time? And to what degree are there other alternatives that can help us think through making sure that the process for evaluating our faculty when they do this work is done in a fair but also open-minded way? And so I kind of leave that as an open question. And I'd like to see, just as a starting question, is there anything else that exists as a mechanism that you can think of that goes beyond these 4 prescriptions?
Not that I can think of right away. I mean, I think you've identified some really interesting notions about what is quantified. But I think I start to look at maybe a hierarchy, and I think the one that's sort of the toughest one, I think, is policy change, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that maybe my predecessor in the community engagement role had a hard time implementing. And I have 2 of my colleagues here from the School of Architecture and Planning, and I think that's a challenge. I think we've sort of adopted some policy changes within the school, but I think that's even one of the challenges I see is that also like how that's reflected outside of our own institution, right? So as you formulate your dossier and then you've got work that represents community engagement, that maybe sometimes it's not really received in the same manner that maybe your colleagues receive it here at the institution. So I think that's been a challenge as well, because there's this sort of ubiquitous understanding about what counts and what doesn't count.
Right.
So I don't know. Do you guys have some thoughts about that? Raina?
Maybe.
Raina?
And then Melissa. Oh, Melissa.
I have a question. So if you're in the College of Fine Arts and you're doing a performance, how do they do that? Because it seems like the journal, the peer-reviewed journals, is just a way so that no one has to read what you did, because there's a metric attached to it. But we expect the outside reviewers to read stuff, and so I guess that's 2 different questions. Like, how is whatever you did any different if someone is going to have to take a close look at it, and that's we rely on this. And then the other part of it is, well, how do they do it for something like performance?
How do you do it for it? Say that part again?
Like, so if I'm dancing,
Yeah.
how does that equate to a peer review journal? For the people in those fields, maybe there's something we can learn from them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think to that point, if I can, I don't want to speak on behalf of CFA or anything like that, but I mean, there's some pretty established traditions for how you measure the quality, or you even kind of have a discussion about the quality of a performance, for example. And there's nothing that precludes us from importing those types of standards. I think even if those standards were imported for somebody outside of, I don't see myself, all transparency, I'm talking to my department chair now, but like all transparency, I don't see myself doing interpretive dance in the near future to talk about economics, but I wouldn't want to preclude the possibility of that, right? Like I don't want to think in a world that is not actually possible. And inside of that, how are you going to convince a very conventional part of the field that is in any way seen as rigorous, given that it is so much of a departure from what you do? I think one of the first steps is, to your point, I think establishing some sort of relationship or line of communication with those who already have a working discussion of what constitutes expertise and what constitutes quality within those discussions. And even then, there's an open discussion about how the community plays a role in those discussions. But I have no illusions that that's confounding, even though that might be perceived as an extreme example. I think we need to lean into those types of examples and see if there's some way of having a fruitful discussion about how it goes forward. But I would say that there's nothing that stops us from importing that discussion into other fields if we're ready and willing to do so. And maybe even additionally importing them, encouraging somebody to have a discussion that is also rewarded about how that's translated into the conventions of the field. Not all journals are just publishing empirical work. They're also talking about methodologies. They're talking about theory. Every field has some other way of critically evaluating the field itself. And I think that there needs to be a reward mechanism inside of even peer-reviewed journals for that kind of discussion to happen.
Well, I'm struck by a sort of internal struggle about what are the multiple things we're trying to accomplish with this. And one is certainly creating mechanisms by which we are, we're getting and giving feedback around work, right? I mean, the best of peer review is when you have somebody who knows a lot about what you're trying to do, and they are giving you a detailed read about questions they have when they're reading your work, and it pushes you to think, right? I don't think that that's often and always what we get, but we also know within even our formal peer review systems, there's, just recently with this, these kind of conversations or near scandal around mathematics, people gaining the systems, all these new journals, these journals that really, the peer review is not fake, and it's all about quantity. But then there is a piece of this that's about accounting for time, right? It's like we have time dedicated to making these contributions, and how do we recognize some things take longer, right? We know ethnography is different than analyzing census data sets. And so there's that piece of it, right? Like really recognizing and having that knowledge be built into our fields if people are doing different kinds of work, and the time that it takes to do that, so that is accounted for tenure and promotion, right? You have time to do this, and you're doing work that is valuable around that, right? And so there's that piece of it too. And then there's this kind of question of impact, which is always like, we definitely, I think, over, like, it's the same thing about this gaming the system, about having things just be citations, right? So people are citing themselves, and their colleagues are citing them, and they're,
Right.
kind of publishing something that may be less impactful, but has really wide readership because it's open source, global, and all these things. Like all these ways that may not be about how the ideas travel as much, or the impact it has and the impact on whom, and more about just having a kind of a metric for impact. And I think that, in a way, these are the things we want, like I'm thinking of this framework, and how do we create a way to say, hey, this is what my work is accomplishing and trying to accomplish, and we know that none of our work accomplishes everything we would hope all the time, and that's, you know, even like, you know, like my research I consider the best isn't always what gets the most attention, you know, like there's all these, but what we're trying to accomplish with this, how we're doing that, the intent around that, how the idea that one of the things we do in the university is wanting these ideas to travel, so how, and maybe that's traveling regionally, you know, maybe that's having an impact on an organization like my colleague Claudia Isaac, who then also work with organizations who then communicate with other organizations, and it's capacity building within this, and then kind of indicating those pieces of it, because I do think that somehow, I was struck yesterday by the deans talking, and they felt more strongly than I do, even though I'm a former chair. So there was a moment I cared a lot about this, but about making sure that actually you're accounting for quality and people's time in there, because otherwise there's going to be people who are just like, you know, and I reviewed these kinds of cases as well, so it's true, but you know, I did a bunch of stuff. And you're like not good enough. And so there has to be this way, you know, like really thinking about what would be a way to do that. And I think with the Indiana University rubric, people have to give a lot of intent, right? This is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, this is the impact that I'm attempting to have or have. But then again, that gets to the question on the work involved in that, and do we have frameworks that can see that? If someone does all that work, will it be received well? And if we start asking our community partners to evaluate in different ways, also we're asking of the people's time. You know, so I feel like there's all these pieces, and I really kind of appreciate how you broke it down, because I think that we need all those pieces. We need to kind of recognize the time. We need to articulate the pathways of dissemination. We need some indicators of quality, but we need to push against this whole quantity equals quality trend that's happening, that everybody feels such pressure to fall into right now. And have all of that be part of this, and then Michael sitting next to me being like, is there a way to do like a rubric? Could we have a way that sort of helps people articulate it? Because partly I know, as somebody who's trying to mentor folks who are doing this and building a tenurable contribution with it, a way to really say, hey, we're going to need this from you. You know, kind of be documenting this as you go along, because there's going to be a moment we're asking you to show, you know, 6 years of work in these pathways, regardless of what it ends up happening, because no matter how good our work is, you never know where you're going to be year 5, year 6, year 3, these things when we think about the university processes. Anyway, that's a lot of thinking out loud.
No, it's good, thank you.
Of course, I'll jump in. I have a question for Renya. When you're saying accounting for people's time, are you thinking that it's different for community engaged work, or that in all of our scholarship we're thinking about the time that it takes to produce, or the time that we're asking people to feed into that system? That's a question.
I mean, I was thinking about the time for the faculty members saying 40% of my effort is dedicated. But you're also right that it is also accounting for the time that other people are contributing and what the value they get from also working in collaboration.
Yes. Well, I can see. One thing I want to say: performance over here. Creative work is also, I think, in the academy, in my opinion, my experience, is subject to peer review. So it's putting on the performance is one thing, but then the performance needs to be evaluated by people who are seen as experts or knowledgeable or whatever in the field. And that was part of the question, I think, was Claudia came up for full, right? Was who's a peer in this kind of work? Community engaged work, which I think is a good question for us to ask. I just want to, I'm in architecture, and there's a lot of community in community design centers And that kind of work, and a small group developed an evaluation system called SEED. So it was intentionally rhyming with LEAD, the Leadership in Environmental and Energy Design. And SEED was for social, economic, and environmental design, and focused on community engaged work, or at least community-based conserving work. But it wore out because of the time, I think, or maybe it's still happening, but they kind of came up with, I can't rattle it off to you now, but I should read it before Thursday, but the list of questions, and then instead of a checklist, it was a bunch of questions, and then volunteer peers would evaluate and determine whether it was reached the level of whatever the SEED goals were to be kind of SEED certified or something like that. But it was all volunteer. There was absolutely no, I think, funded infrastructure, or there has been. No, I don't want to say it's gone away. That may be something for us to look to. And I think I also have an example of some pretty detailed rubrics from the University of Oklahoma.
I'd love to see
Yeah, I'd love to see that, yeah. I think that the notion of time is an interesting one, because I think that, if you've done that kind of work, that it's an arduous commitment, right? It takes a long time to build trust in the community, to be able to understand the participants, and then really, working with students, which a lot of the work that we've done in the School of Architecture tends to have a lot of student participation. And so, I wonder about that, in serving on the provost committee for TNP, some of the things that you see that come in is that you'll have faculty members that will say, well, I've got a book, under review right now. And so that, and you never know if that book gets published, right? And so I wonder if that is maybe something that also could be applied to a community engagement scholar, right? I think the impact is really important, to be able to understand that, there is an audience, and that it's going to have some ultimate impact, but would that fly? And I think that's a question that I have, is like, can somebody say that, yeah, I'm in the process, it takes time, and and so I kind of throw that back out to the audience, to maybe, is that something that would fly?
Well, as you know, Tim, our current project is looking at the impact of DPAC, our Community Design Center, over a 25-year period. And so it was like, yeah, we could just write, yeah, look, here's some pictures, we did this project, we did this project, we did this project. One thing led to another. I mean, the idea was a book, or we still have the book, or what's that? But on the way, we're at least sketched a plan for community engaged evaluation, where we ask a number of people, what impacts do they see, what do they think is an impact or a metric, to talk about impact, and then hopefully kind of backing out of that process, a kind of maybe somewhat consistent or framework for not just evaluating, but planning our work in the future. And that kind of relates to also our university required assessments and our professional accreditation, our program accreditation, that asks for us to set goals and objectives, and then assess ourselves against those goals, record our progress, not saying you're going to finish everything over here or whatever, but record our progress, and then demonstrate that we make adjustments based on what we learn from that assessment. And I don't know if there's something in that existing frameworks that we could adapt while while also critiquing.
Yeah, I want to build off of that. I think, first of all, I want to recognize what you say about time and process. We make the very quick assumption that all intellectual products are linear, and that the publication itself is kind of erases everything else as a final product. And that's not true. Like even in a peer-reviewed journal, you can have some pretty robust community-engaged research that exists, but it won't be seen as anything but the final product in the end, when in and of itself, it had its own kind of pathway. It wasn't like it was just kind of a tunnel that kind of just got passed through. It might have split off in 2 or 3 different directions. And I think, to your point, I don't think there's anything that precludes us from being creative enough in evaluating one's work to not just see the publication as the final product, but to see points, maybe key points of departure, as being elements that can be evaluated in and of themselves. I know that in the business world, they would call that a part of a value chain analysis, right? So like there was a point where there was an intensity of value added in the process, and if it reaches a certain threshold, it actually is a final product in and of itself. Like it becomes part of the value proposition of what you did, maybe even more than the final product itself. So in all the baking of the ingredients, if you do something so intensively special or reaching a high level of quality or whatnot, you can actually stop there and actually call that out as having a different kind of relationship to the overall value of what we're doing. We still have a very linear model for how we value the research of each of our faculty.
Yeah, because it's a transfer between like from America.
Yes? I hope that was a question, because that would be
Do you
awesome.
have questions?
Yeah.
We should be creative enough to be able to stop and say that those things have their stops. I mean, I know I'm new to the economics department, but I know a lot of faculty now who are putting a ridiculous amount of work in developing their data. And the way that they develop their data has a lot of creative ways in which that's done. And I would say that some of those creative and innovative pathways are probably just as important, if not more so, than the final product that they produce. And in and of themselves, they're both performative, they're engaged, there's lots of different ways in which that can be seen. But I don't yet know if we're at a place where we've had a way of communicating, even with the most conventional sides of ourselves within the university, about how those stopping points exist.
I think one of the things that I'm kind of interested is a place like Arizona State, with the president's mission that, I think he calls it social embeddedness, and really.
That's Michael Crow.
Yeah, Michael Crow, and really looking at, maybe thinking outside of the silos, right? The academic silo, and really the impact in communities. And so, I throw that out there because I think like a place like New Mexico, where we have a lot of opportunity to have community impact, and that we write it into our mission plan for the future, the 2020-40, which, advance the state of New Mexico, right? It seems essential to really think about, what we're doing. But I think that in some ways, the system's not working for us, right? And we were just having this discussion about, what does that look like in terms of leadership, right? And how does, I think we can be grassroots driven and try to, shape the tower. But in some ways, I think it's almost, it hasn't worked. Hasn't worked, and so I throw it back, to my colleagues to think about, how do we make this change?
How about a working group that could kind of start to sketch out a framework of rubrics and considerations, and then also it can start with faculty and then grow to, should be reviewed by administrators, by community members, kind of gather as much as we can about the different ways that this work is seen, the way that it's done, so that we have a pretty broad understanding and can see some points that could be leveraged and evaluated for the quality of and the significance, really significance of community-engaged work. It's not a lot of it. We shouldn't be experimenting, right? So too much. I just invented this new thing, and I'm going to take it out to this community of vulnerable people and have them try it. But it tends to be, I think, a practice or scholarship of integration and scholarship of application. Although we may be creative about how we do it, so how do we evaluate that?
Well, one thing I do want to kind of latch on to, because I thought that one of the things that maybe we can do in the future is talk about how community engaged research is really hard, first of all, and it is very complicated. But one of the things that it isn't always about engaging vulnerable populations as well.
Right.
It's about engaging a bunch of different, the concept of community is a very, very complex and amorphous concept as well. And based on the quality of how you're identified and engaging with that is also kind of an important thing. But the working group, I think, is essential. Thank you for coming. I hope that influences my future evaluations. But the way that I think about it is also the administration. The onus is on them to have a receiving mechanism for that work once a work group goes. Because if you develop all of that stuff and then you throw it at a wall and it just bounces back at you, that could have longer lasting effects on the faculty than having done nothing at all. Because that could be seen as institutional, not betrayal, but it is just kind of a letdown, right? Like you have all of that work and then you don't know where it's going to go. The other part of it is also communities don't always have access to this very Byzantine structure that we call academic evaluations. And so like there's a dual psychology to that as well. Like people who are doing community engaged research are receiving a lot of feedback, both critical but also positive feedback and reinforcement about the work that they're doing from communities, however we're defining that. And then when it comes back to the evaluation process, that dissonance that occurs when you realize all of that positive or critical, all that feedback, regardless of what you're getting, that relationship is nigh invisible inside of that Byzantine structure. So how do you deal with that as well? I think that requires a very significant push from administration to already say the receiving end is going to be there when the work is done.
I think, from the meeting that we had with the deans yesterday, it was really interesting because I think we've got a lot of new deans in place and fairly receptive to community engagement. But I think that, that being said, there is this sort of institutional hill we've got to overcome. And I think that's, the working group makes a lot of sense. I think, having an interdisciplinary group, but then, in some ways it also has to come from the top. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that the president is committed, and I think the provost is committed, but I think it has to have a little bit more leverage, and when I took this position and brought it to the committee, I was like, do we need the Carnegie classification? I was like, what is it doing for us?
Yeah, what does it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think it does put us in a unique group of institutions, but I don't think we've really positioned that in any kind of way.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's probably its biggest impact has not been in advertising the university, but actually in forcing us to look at or giving us the opportunity to look at our community engagement and how it is valued through policy, through faculty, through students, through curriculum, all those things. And right now I'm thinking of all kinds of stuff because, we apply, we want to get that. Not because we want to wear a sticker or something, but because we want to achieve that standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And be recognized for it.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think, I am in the Department of Community and Regional Planning, many of you know that, but come out of urban studies, so that's kind of the discipline that or interdisciplinary discipline that I feel like I'm located in. And the interesting thing about looking at social theory is as much social theory that's been impactful in the 20th century, the theorists were theorizing from the ground, not from scholarship. And so like if we think of Karl Marx, for example, that it's not because they didn't know scholarship, but they were seeing the world unfold, and that's been impactful. And I think one thing is that we have a hard time, or I have a hard time grappling with this, is I think it's knowledge building, which is the mission of the university. And sharing knowledge, like the idea of synthesis being more useful for policymakers than any kind of research, right? Like it's never going to be the one study that says like, oh, now we understand how to do this. It's much more kind of that building and shaping. And that is an important role, that somebody who is like sort of grounded in the academic world can bring that synthesis and knowledge or do it. And these are parts of that. But I think that really seeing that work is, that we want our faculty who are doing this work to be bringing, like, kind of working collaborative knowledge building as part of this, because part of I know part of my tension around this is I think when people when they're sort of disengaged from how people are living with things and experiencing it, just the scholarship isn't as good. Like, I read lots of analyses on social change that is based on, quantitative analyses, and all of it tells you something, but it definitely tells you nothing about people's experiences. And so it's just, it does really different things, and I don't know, obviously that's also, kind of been slow, but I also think that really recognizing it, that there are some direct contributions, but it is also trying to value this iterative, communicative, collaborative knowledge building, that having the questions be sort of, relevant, and the multiple ways of knowing being built into this. And I often think, like, I've done some work around people experiencing environmental change in Louisiana along the coast, and one person was saying, hey, my dad saw this long ago. He said, all these water bodies is sort of a swamp area. They're opening up because more people are coming here. This is God's way of making space. And I just know that, in some ways, he's seeing this change. He's articulating it in a way. And people would say, it's not about God. It's, oil drilling. But you think, but we're also watching all our climate models be wrong. And then we say, oh, well, the assumptions are wrong. Or we have all these explanations. But we're like, in some ways you could just say, if you don't believe it's God, you could just say, assumption wrong. But what he was observing was saying, and they were saying it long ago. And these were also people who were saying, and, ever since oil and gas exploration came in here, this has been happening faster, and nobody was listening. Or they didn't want to listen, or the politics of it, right? So you can just see all these patterns, and part of it is trying to get this knowledge that people have into the conversation so it can shape policy so it's relevant, and it's that piece of it. And I think that whatever we do, I keep wanting to claim that, right? Is that it's not simply saying that we're doing work that we want to have impact, even though we want work to have impact, but it's also because we recognize that we have limits to what we consider, like our scientific practices have limits. And those limits are, are gaps that are meaningful and make the work that comes out of it less impactful, more likely to be kind of based in error, whether that's error and how people will take it up, whether it's going to be meaningful, whether it's kind of resonating in different ways. And maybe that's more true in social sciences and some disciplines, but I feel like that piece of it is part of it, but
Thank
that's
you.
definitely not a couple of years. You know, that oftentimes that those things, like all knowledge production is, you know, we claim our contributions because we have to do that within this time frame, you know. I mean, in our discipline, we say one important contribution from your dissertation, a second one that's original in yours before you earn tenure so that you can show that you're going to have this trajectory. I mean, that it's so like check the box, my new contributions, new area that I've developed. And it's like, how to get out of that, but still recognize this is knowledge creation as well as sharing knowledge in ways that are more meaningful. Like it's both ways.
We have to come to terms with the fact that we are part of the instrument that destroyed the public intellectual. Like the university system itself, we have done something to the life of the mind that we all were called to do, that is one of the most important aspects of who we are, but we're not rewarded for it because it's not the way that the world is measuring it. And in some ways, we've denied ourselves the very thing that makes us good at what we do. I mean, we're really good at thinking, but we're not. I mean, if somebody asked me, I asked my 10-year-old cousin, asked me what I do, and I'll give him some sort of like really like elaborate way of describing what I do, and he'll tell me that's totally stupid. And he's totally right. He's 100% right. But if I told him that I get paid to think, like that would blow his mind. That would totally blow his young mind. And yet, we're not willing to have that conversation with ourselves about the fact that we're paid to think, to really explore and discover, and all of those things aren't necessarily measured by the way we pay our bills and the way that we're evaluated on an annual basis. And it's a little frustrating. And I think there is an anti-intellectualism that, and I'm not going to try to ruminate on where the roots of it come from, but we live in a world where there is a very real disparagement of expertise. There's a very real strain of anti-intellectualism in our body politic and in society. And I think sometimes we permit that to happen at our own expense. We don't defend the very things that make us who we are as intellectuals. And we don't defend our own when they take the risk of actually thinking in front of people rather than doing what is conventional to do because it will add to your impact factor. Or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point because I think, you know, the one thing that academia hasn't really figured out is interdisciplinary and how we think about and how we merit that. You know, I think that's a real big challenge. I mean, you know, I think of myself, you know, as somebody that loves doing interdisciplinary work. It's not until after tenure that I was able to explore that. I remember a colleague in engineering that was working with me at the lab, and he left. He went to go with Google, but he was an artist. He was a computer scientist. You know, he did all these things, but he knew that road wasn't going to lead to tenure. So he might as well go make money at Google, right? And so he left. You know, and I think, and it's unfortunate, you know, because then we lose, you know, a very creative mind that had tremendous potential, but then it never gets realized. And so, you know, I think that's the unfortunate nature of, you know, again, these silos. You know?
Yeah. Da Vinci, Marie Curie, all of these people would never get tenure in our R1 system.
Right.
They wouldn't.
I think, you know, even like looking at the land-grant institutions, you know, I think they've done a whole kind of assessment of, you know, the public good. Right, and they've done maybe a better job than the R1s have in terms of really thinking about that kind of civic engagement. And you know, I was just reading their kind of new iteration of that, and I thought, well, there's some things that we can borrow from there. I think it's an uphill battle in terms of institutionalizing that, and you know, maybe I'll retire before that ever gets implemented. But it is something that I think that we need to kind of in this forum, in these, I don't know what community panels, we need to start to figure out a little better. You know. Yeah.
I propose we get stranger.
Stranger.
Oh, I would love to be stranger about the way that we talk about community engagement. Like I would love Like, I have a colleague who has invited me to a paper, and I'm totally in my infinite free time. I'm totally in, but he's starting a paper called Anti-Social Entrepreneurship. And what he wants to do is he wants to challenge the conventions or how we romantically create like entrepreneurship for good, which, yes, we do that. We do some wonderful things for good, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who never benefit who are left out. And then their response is seen as antisocial, and they do like really interesting, cool things to just critically evaluate that. And then you kind of see, well, yeah, there's actually a much richer, robust concept of community, even those people who are responding to one another in a very complex universe of how people talk about, quote unquote, the good and what is public, that I think would inspire a lot of faculty members. But we don't have kind of these strange entryways to kind of show all of the different interesting points of articulation that can happen. Again, I think we censor ourselves a lot in order to fit the convention, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges I'm having right now is the notion of mentorship. You know, we've got a new faculty member that is a community scholar, and you know, in some ways, you know, we're kind of having to tell him, stop maybe doing what you do well, right, to fit the mold of the institution. And so, you know, but at the same time, you know, that's his passion. That's, you know, where he's really made a mark. But, you know, go get some peer-reviewed journals as well. And I think that's a little frustrating, you know, to be able to tell somebody to reconfigure who they are as a scholar. And so I don't know. I mean, I you know, in some ways, you know, kind of walk the middle ground would probably be the best advice. But, you know, as a mentor, I'm like, you know, I think that's maybe not what I'd like to do. You know, I'd like to tell somebody, go do this. You're really good at that. I don't know. I'd put it out there.
I'm feeling like at my first review that I was going to get fired for doing the job I was hired to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just,
Have you guys ever heard of the example of Beverly Hills 902H2O? It was a startup company that created bottled water, straight from the pure fountains of Los Angeles, and it was $100,000 a bottle, and they were able to market and sell out their entire inventory. But what they did was they were actually intentionally being they were buying into a market strain or a market logic, and all of the proceeds then went to a number of public programming that they were interested in. And then they outed themselves and said, yeah, this is actually what our entrepreneurial venture was trying to do. And it revealed, like, if it's kind of sad that you can't get a community garden funded, but you can sell a bottle of water for $100,000, right? But now that bottle of water is now funding the community garden, right? So like it's very interesting to see how the gymnastics of how we play this little game we play in intellectual thought, like what is popular and how that disseminates as valuable information and where value comes from is such an important part of this discussion, I think.
Are there any questions online? No.
let me ask.
Well, this is great.
What kinds of things do you think should be considered for community engaged scholarship that aren't part of the existing framework?
You know, I'm really tapping and vibing with what you said about like just kind of stages of development, right? But I think that there are stages of development that are part and parcel. I think I really would like outside of, what I would love is outside of fine arts. I'm a very big fan of Franco Moretti. So like he wrote a book called Grass, Maps, and Trees. And he tries to be a quantitative analyst of literature. And then he tries to see how literature informs quantitative analysis, whatnot. I'd like to have the university invest in mixing that stuff up and actually just testing it out and playing through. Like, can there be an element of performance in an economics department? And can there be an element of quantitative research that is done in fine arts in a way that introducing that form of empiricism and just seeing if those conversations actually, they don't even have to actually lead to something. They're the work. I mean, I hate to be that guy, the journey is the destination, but I mean, it really is an academic work. We just have to do a better job of marking it as such. I mean, I know that we already have mechanisms like that in place. We have for example, if you're a department chair now, you can give special consideration to somebody writing a book and basically say they might be operating within the 3-year peer review timeline that kind of is the Office of Research kind of reporting structure. But if you have a book accepted, you know, that's a benchmark that actually has its own life. There's other things that you can do with a book. I don't see why you couldn't do that with a series of performances, with a series of testimonies. If you actually went to a community and you actually galvanized what everybody universally, or not even universally, but generally would think is a very high quality element of public discourse, all of those different things I think could be counted. It's just, I think we need to be more comfortable with the forms. It's like Anthony Appiah, I borrow a lot from him when he talks about cosmopolitanism, but I think it's more about getting used to things. Like there's strangeness inside of this university, but we're not used to them. And I think we need to get used to, I think an economist needs to get used to the fact that interpretive dance is a way of building knowledge in the world. And if they're not acquainted with that on the daily in their work, the more they do that, I think we have a more cosmopolitan, interdisciplinary research structure.
I have one thought before we close out, because I think we're kind of,
Well, I just have one more question. So when you did an exhibit instead of a book or a peer-reviewed journal,
Right.
what was your intention? Why did you choose that?
I did it because I thought that the question was going to reach a lot of people and I could actually get my thinking into an entirely different realm of thinking, because the whole curation I did was about currencies and how currencies are drawn. And so we had an entire show at 516 Arts about like how people draw currencies and what that means to sovereignty, how that develops a question of like, why is that money more important than the money that funny money, or even Bitcoin or digital currencies? Like there's bigger questions at hand about why currency is both accepted and signified in the way that it does. And just wanted to have a more public conversation about that, right? Like, why is it, we got a printmaker from South Korea who is responsible for making the first currencies of the Korean Republic. Like, and so like there was this like beautiful expose of like what it takes to actually draw like for a nation and to actually draw a currency like that. And why is it that you choose certain things and others, and what are the politics involved in that? And we got into talking about all the different ways in which monetary nationalism and sovereign currencies and all of that stuff could be exposed. That for me was more productive than 1,000 articles that I could have done on the concept of monetary sovereignty. And in fact, the little piece that I wrote, I think, was probably disseminated more on I had a little subsection like that asked a question in the museum: why don't we have a global currency? And it was a big question, and then they had to draw what they thought a global currency would look like, and then you started to see everybody was interacting with those types of things. You learn a whole lot about the nature and the quality of the question that you would never do in a peer-reviewed journal process.
it's great. And that wasn't received very well. And
It didn't count.
didn't count.
Did you publish a peer-reviewed journal article about it?
I haven't yet. Yeah, I haven't yet, but I will. But it's one of the. Actually, to be honest, it had a psychological effect. Like I really questioned whether or not there was any value in any of that, right? And so even the question itself went in an entirely different direction.
And it generated information that you hadn't come up with, and might not have come up with yourself. We go back to what Brenda said about both knowledge building, like these multiple sources of expertise and knowledge, where the scholar or academic gathers and synthesizes that information and then creates new knowledge or shares new insights based on that process that would not have otherwise come out. I even drew it.
Nice.
No,
But I
want to see
didn't
it.
draw the global currency. I'm going to work on that.
Okay, all right. I look forward to seeing it. I look forward to seeing it.
That's great.
But I think that's one way to think about it.
Yeah.
Rather than, what does your lit review look like?
Right. Yeah.
Bessie Smith.
I think we're close out of time, but I did want to throw one question out. And it's like, it's really about the way we think about funding. And, and the way that the R1 funding mechanism potentially doesn't work for community engagement. And, how do we think about it? Because, community engagement needs funding, right? And so, for example, when you have a small community that has, a small amount of money that they want to work with you, it's not always easy to bring that in to the institution, right? And I've struggled with that.
Without getting cut in half.
Without getting cut in half.
Or the anti-donation clause.
The anti-donation clause. In fact, one of our colleagues yesterday said, I brought funding in through the foundation because I couldn't get it to work any other way. So, there are these avenues, and I think that, that's part of this as well, is that, the institution isn't set up to help us do this kind of work. And I don't know if any of you have some thoughts about how to make that better.
I found that really interesting. I had never thought about it. I think it was Rebecca Sanchez that brought that up, saying that bringing in her funding through the foundation because of whatever reasons it had to work that way, but that didn't count as funded research somehow because it's a gift, So I was thinking, I always count like whatever we get from McKean or, one of the other community foundations, yes, that funded this project. But it was really interesting to think about that, and I don't know how. I have not been in a discussion where that became a bone of contention, like where the money came from. But it is really interesting.
Yeah.
I think that in our school, we don't have any particular expectations about external funds. So if anyone is applying and receiving them, it's good. And of course, the dean's feeling the university pressure and so on, so we hear it, but it just hasn't been something that's ever been built into tenure promotion guidelines, and so we don't have to apply, we don't have to receive them. So I think that we may also feel a little differently about it, but it also makes me think of one of our colleagues who said that was working on a community engaged project, and at a certain point they had done all these different steps, and then the community partners were just saying, okay, next step is this kind of installation, but the funding they had used wasn't allowed to be used for that. And so then, and they're just like, we don't want to do these other, we just did all these other things, we're ready. And it just wasn't, and there was actually, kind of still grant funding for the project, but it just couldn't be used for that kind of thing. So I do think that there's also a need to continue to see what people, the wide range of things, thinking on your earlier point about the community engagement actually means so many different things. It's like different kinds of collaborative kind of endeavors is how people are trying to fund it and where the gaps are, as well as where the gaps are even through existing funding agencies. I mean, it's fine to say NSF is now funding community engaged work, but none of their mechanisms are designed for it at all. So it's like community engaged work on this time frame, and then people like Lonnie who are just can't happen at that speed. And so that's the question, is that the university, is that thinking externally, is that where does that commitment lie? Is that the university in conversation with the state? I mean, to some degree that's RPSP saying things matter to us, the state pays for them more directly.
That's a good, although none of the RPSPs got funded this year, so.
It's not, but that's,
I understand,
What is this that what we're doing, and then why through the university, and that's the part that, I guess I keep going back to, that question on recognizing that we all build knowledge, all people build knowledge, and then universities have this role in trying to mobilize that in some ways, and that's what we're trying to do, is contribute something, knowing that people build knowledge in their lives, but what is it, the land grants, you know, and the extensions are having these more deeper collaboration, so, you know, trying to build the trust and the knowledge and sharing that, and in a way, trying to think, how do we do that more often? And I think, you know, particularly in disciplines that are not just seeing, like, kind of spinning off, like tech transfer, you know, like, how do we do that across a wider range of disciplines?
Yeah. And how does the university catalyze that stuff?
Yeah.
Because you could have an office of community engagement, and it could be very much a very lame bureaucratic institution very quickly. But you know what's awesome, what I've seen here at UNM is there's a lot of people who have so many powerful questions that could be part of the agenda of an office like that. It would never run out of time to do the thing. I mean, it would always have something interesting to be producing, and you could always see it from different angles. Thinking about the state, I mean, even the question of data, like what's the difference between administrative data and community data? Like even that question alone could occupy an agenda for an office like that for a whole year. And people could contribute to that in ways that right now it's not being invited, that discussion, right? It's taken for granted that if you have data from the National Institutes for Health, it's a good data set that you have. And the community is nowhere near represented within that particular data set. So you can do so many wonderful things just by even the creativity of the institution is really I think the calling card right now.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're close to the time. I want to thank you so much for your
Tim,
comments.
thank you as always.
And thank you for our colleagues for showing up and
Yes.
sticking around. Appreciate you guys. So
Thank you for coming online.
yes, and
Appreciate you.
Thank you.